Loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you always. Amen. Please be seated. I didn't grow up farming. Anyone here grow up farming? No? No? So it's a bit unusual for us, but in Jesus' time that would have been a really common thing. I grew up in Innisfail with sugarcane farms all around me. I can still remember the smell. It's a body memory. If you talked about sugarcane, I'd be like, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. But you know, I married into a farming family. My husband's aunt and uncle have always farmed. Uncle Marsh farmed wheat, ran cattle for a while, sorghum, milo, all of those things. So this is a story that would speak directly to that family. And Marsh met the local teacher, Jill. Now, everyone knows in a country community, when you get a good primary school teacher, you marry them to a farmer, right? And then you keep them. Jill is one of the best humans I know. And she became the local primary school teacher in Proston at that time. And the reason I tell you about Jill and Marsh today is because Jill told me the best thing before I became a speech pathologist when I was studying. And she said this: when she has a child in her classroom that is found difficult by people, the difficult child, and I'll put that in inverted commas, she said her way of approaching it, she finds one thing that she really admires about them, one thing that she likes. And she said sometimes it's as simple as the way they part their hair. That's the thing she can find. And every time she feels the grip and the heat, she goes, I really like the way that person parts their hair. Farmers know things. And today's parable is a farming parable. And we hear about weeds, in inverted commas. Now, when I think weeds, I think of what's called the wandering Jew in my garden that I had to try and get rid of, and that was a hopeless case. Do you know that's quite a racist term, and it's also called creeping Christian in other circumstances. But you know, the weed that goes everywhere and can't actually be extinguished. Well, thank God the Jews are like that, to be perfectly honest. But what is the wheat we're talking about today? It's important to know. The plant, archaeologists think, is a plant called tares. And that's the weed of our parable today. It's also known in English as cheat and drunk, darnel, false wheat, and poison ryegrass. This is a weed, right? And it is still today regarded as one of the worst weeds in the world. It's been a constant and very unwelcome scourge of farmers since the dawn of agriculture in the Middle East. And it's only in modern times with modern mechanical farming that it's become more manageable. But even today in the developing world, it still continues to infect farms extensively, as much as it always has done. And that's from an article by Coulsland in 2015. That's a pretty good description of evil, isn't it? It's a good description of sin. What is the impact of these weeds? Now, one of the first people to chronicle the symptoms of tares ingested the substance himself, scientifically, right? So it's good science, but ethically, you wouldn't do it today. So he dosed himself, Paul Ants is his name, and he recorded the effects systematically. And this is what he said he experienced. Disordered senses, a combination of numbness in the head and headache, dizziness and an irresistible urge to sleep, extreme debility, cramps, vomiting, diarrhoea and a chilling of the extremities and a decrease in his core temperature and heart rate. It was some days before he returned to a normal state. This is getting a better analogy of evil and sin still, isn't it? Now, one of the key issues with tares in your crop is yield. So the tare weeds are more successful at growing than grain. They're more successful at taking nutrients of the soil, they're more successful in reaching the light. And as a result, the crop losses can range from anywhere from 17% to 62% of the crop. Tares influences the wheat as well. And in densely sown fields where things are sown closely together, they compete for the available light. The weed also has a fibrous subsystem of roots, and that enables it firstly to compete for water and nutrients in the soil, and as we heard in our parable today, it also means that it is capable of uprooting wheat when it is pulled as well. It's near impossible to separate out tares from wheat because as it grew alongside the wheat in the farms of modern agriculture, it actually developed and looks exactly like wheat. So it's near impossible to sort. Even the grains, you can't sieve them, they're the same size. So this is what we're talking about in our parable today. A crop of wheat, and a crop that you can spot is not right. There are weeds amongst it, but there's nothing really you can do. Now, today's reading is clearly explained by Jesus at the end. We heard Jesus' explanation. It is an apocalyptic message. It is an apocalyptic message and a promise of judgment. Evil and sin thrive unchecked now. However, evil and sin will be weeded out at the end of time, and the kingdom will be gathered together. At the end of time, all will be made right. Now, for those who look into the face of evil today, Ukraine, for example, is probably the best example. In violent homes in the face of child abuse, when terrible, evil things happen, that message is one of comfort. In oppressed Israel and Palestine at that time, it would have been a message of comfort. That truth would be seen, that people would be answerable for what happened. Is this a message of hope yet? Where's the hope? That leaves us still in a futile place, doesn't it? To let this parable speak only at the surface means that we miss the sustenance of its roots. So let's go deeper. Let's consider for us as modern readers what the parable tells us about the very nature of evil itself and how we are to live in this world that is not fair. God knows the world is not fair. 2,000 years ago, Jesus told us we would live in a world that is not fair. Turns out everyone was asleep when the enemy came, comfortable in their place. Evil begins when we are comfortably asleep. We don't notice it creeping in and sowing its seeds. When we think nothing bad will happen to us, not on our field, not on our patch. Evil and sin are sown quietly, unnoticed. And then it grows, appearing for all extents and purposes like the grain that it evolved to mimic. It takes what the good grain wants to draw from and it turns it into something toxic and more prevalent. And once sown, it is unable to be disentangled from the life-giving, nourishing crop. And so it has to grow together. Now, you could destroy the whole crop and start over. And you could begin again with good seed. And we've seen this in the Bible, haven't we? If you think about Noah and the ark and the flood. If you think about the destruction, even earlier still, of Sodom and Gomorrah. Wipe it out, start again with good seed. And we saw what happened. It didn't solve the problem of evil. It didn't solve the problem of sin. Over and again, the weeds appear and the toxicity creeps back in. Wiping out everything is fruitless, especially when Jesus notes in this parable when so much good is present. The only choice is to let it play out, to let it grow and sort it out in the end. Is that still futile, though? A little bit more hope. Or is it simply a call to persevere through all the awfulness? Or perhaps we can look at this instead as a call to the wheat to flourish in the face of evil. A promise that we will not be wiped out, that good cannot be wiped out. So let's put this into a more modern context. Bit of audience participation here. In our modern world, in the last 150 years, I wish I had some chocolates to throw to you. What is the single biggest systematic presence and development of evil that you can think of? What is the most evil thing that has happened in our world, in our memory, at least that we know about? Hitler, the Holocaust, the uprising of Nazism in Germany. Does everyone kind of feel like that is a pretty good description? Yeah. What was that? The atomic bomb. World War I and World War II. Right? Absolutely. Evil. Evil. And so what we have is this story. How does this tell us how we can face those mind-bending events, those unfathomable events? Let's talk about the Holocaust. In the Holocaust, otherwise good people did terrible, terrible things. It wasn't just Hitler. Hitler might have just started along. He certainly was charismatic enough to sow some seeds. But so many people participated. Good people, wheat. Did they transform from wheat into weeds? Now, the tares are so similar to wheat that was an ancient hypothesis. The ancients wondered, well, maybe the weed turns the wheat into weed because they were so much more prevalent and so similar. Maybe that toxicity spreads and changes the very nature of the wheat. We know today that's not what it is. For the wheat in Germany, is it even possible that seed that comes from Christ's own DNA, sowed by the Father, can become a weed? If we look at what happened next, if every person who did evil at that time, who participated in the atrocity, if every single person was a weed and irredeemable and was to be pulled up at the end of time, what would Europe look like today? Was there no good in the ones who participated in evil? Was there no hope of redemption? Or did the grain grow with light and truth? Was there the good seed, the good stem waiting to break through the weed? Sometimes wheat can be hidden amongst the weeds, and it's not just in Germany. I think we should all go and see the new movie about the creation of the atomic bomb and the race for the destruction of our world, essentially. And if we want to look closely about weeds and wheat, let's look at the Milgram experiment. that illustrated just how evil can become widespread. It's famous. Anyone who did Psychology 101 at university will have heard about this experiment. Participants at Yale University in America entered a room with an actor, and they thought that actor was another participant. So they thought they were with another participant. They drew straws and they were assigned the role of teacher. The other participant was a learner. They were supervised by a scientist in a lab coat. And the teacher was to teach word pairs to the learner and deliver electric shocks when the learner got it wrong. Now, I can tell you, speech pathologists used to deliver electric shocks to people every time they stuttered. So let's not be too judgmental. Positive reinforcement works better. Let's just add that. So the shocks were actually not real, although the person who was the teacher had experienced a shock, so they thought it was real. They thought they were delivering shocks right up to 450 volts, which is a fatal dose. And as instructed, they kept going every time the actor made a mistake. Every time the learner pleaded in front of them, in spite of the learner telling them that they had a heart condition, they continued to give shocks to what they believed was 300 volts. Every single participant. And 65% of people went to the maximum 450 volts. Isn't that two-third figure eerily like crop losses in the presence of tares? It was shocking. And even the investigators were surprised. They expected 1 to 3% of people would continue on giving shocks when the person objected. 1 to 3% was what they hypothesised. People wouldn't do that. They thought that 0.1% of people might go up to that fatal dose. Milgram thought that it was the Germans that had a unique disposition to follow authority into evil. The American group that he started with was supposed to be the comparator. And the study was replicated across the world. It was absolutely consistent across countries, across cultures, and in a meta-analysis of all the studies, the average of people prepared to deliver a fatal shock to instruction was comparable to that first study, 66%. Turned out, the potential for widespread evil was not over there in Germany. It was not a German cultural thing. It was human. We would all like to assume that we wouldn't participate in an evil like the Holocaust, or at least I would. That evil somehow is over there, not on our patch, and back then even, except the evidence is that most of us could, even without the risk of real harm to ourselves. Are we then all weeds waiting to be destroyed, pulled up at the end of time? Are we bad to the roots, destructive? Are we the write-off at the harvest? Where's the hope? The gospel is a message of hope. So we need to look closer again at the reading. Did you notice Jesus say that at the harvest, his angels will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers? All causes of sin and all evildoers. Two things: causes of sin, evildoers. So, just who is an evildoer? And who is it that has been impacted by the causes of sin? What is a weed? What is wheat? And what is wheat affected by the weed? You can't tell. We can't tell. We can't know for sure. Look how similar the tares are to the wheat. And it's here that we have a crystal clear instruction that we don't belong in the judgment seat. To think we are good grain and that weed is over there, that's to miss the point. We live amongst evil and sin, or the potential for evil and sin at the very least. We can't help but be impacted by things that would take us away from what is true and life-giving and nourishing. To say that sin belongs to the weed over there, that's to be asleep. That's to be at risk. To think that selfishness, compliance with the wrong authority, failure to see God and our neighbours belongs with them, with the Germans, with whoever we're going to separate out, with those weeds, is to ignore the parasite and the rust gnawing at our own stalk and the entanglement at our roots. Worse still, in thinking that evil is over there with him or her or them, we have for too long ignored the landowner's instructions to the slaves. Now, Jesus doesn't tell us who those slaves are. Did you notice that? Those slaves wanted to pull the weeds. They were outraged for the farmer. How dare those weeds be here? You planted good seed. This is not right, not fair. But the sower knows better. If you try to isolate the weed and pull it out, its connection with everything that is good will be pulled along with it. How often are we the slaves wanting to take things into our own hands? Deciding who it is that's in and out. Naming the weed. Ignoring our own entanglements under the surface. How often, in the name of Christ, in the name of the church, have we seen widespread weeding attempted? People labelled sinners, cast out, discarded, hopeless. Has that ever ended well for us? Was it worth the effort? Was it worth the trauma? And believe me, it's trauma. Was it worth the damage? Who is it that can assess where good ends and evil begins? Milgram's experiment shows us how naive we are. There is no easy separation of the tares from the grain. The wheat will be affected by the power of the weed, the greed, the dominance, the disease, and the parasites of the tares in its midst. The one that names the weed in front of them without seeing the impact of the weeds upon themselves, does it bring to mind Jesus' comments about specks and logs? Now, before the Milgram study, we might have thought differently. We did all think differently. We thought we could see the difference with our naked eyes, that it was obvious. We believed ourselves uncontaminated, that with an extreme moral challenge, the stalk of our wheat would stand strong and could pull itself free of the tangle of the weed. 2,000 years ago, Jesus knew that wasn't true at all. The weeds of evil and the roots of sin were sown in secret, grown in stealth, until it was too late. In the parables field, in Nazi Germany, in the world today, we didn't see it until it was too late. Because we're all comfortably sleeping, never imagining it could happen in our own field. Where is the hope? This is a comparison. We're not stuck. We can lift our little weedy, not our weedy, let's hopefully not the weedy, we can lift our little stalks up and our roots. We can find some sunshine. We can gather together. It's a comparison. It shows how evil is sown. It calls us to be awake. We can find the sun's warmth and love. And how beautiful in English that we have the two meanings of sun. We can look at a person and think, where is the wheat? Where is the wheat in this person? And here is the end of my little parable of Marsh and Jill and the farm in Proston. I took Jill's advice, and in every person I saw, I looked for something good. And I hadn't actually thought about this at the time, or I thought about it at the time, but not until after this conversation. When I was a speech pathologist directing a team, I would take on the most difficult clients. And I'm sorry I call them difficult clients now. And people said, how did you manage to get them into therapy doing what they needed to do? And we used to joke, it was pixie dust. It was the clinician's magic. And do you know what it was? Every person that came in was Jill in my ear, the farmer's wisdom, saying, find something you like about them. Find the good in them. Let them know that you can see the good will grow. See the wheat, not the weed. And the wheat will flourish. In the name of Christ. Amen.